I'm very pleased that we have Joihn Perkins here for the second time. He was our guest in 2008, and I briefly introduce him and ask him to talk about his subject, which is economy. In the introduction to this book, his last book, Hoodwinked, which is in the back, and Mansour is selling this book over in the back. He said, Joihn said, I was an economic hitman, EHM, part of an elite corps of a modern day hired guns who promote the interests of big corporations and certain sectors of the US government. I had a fancy title, Chief Economist, and a staff of highly qualified economists, management consultant, and financial analysts who produced impressive reports that appeared legitimate. But my real job was to deceive and plunder the third world. Although we, economic hitmen, work in many ways, our most common task is to identify countries with resources our corporation covet. Then we seduce, bribe, extort their leaders into exploiting their own people, accepting loans the country can never repay, privatizing their national assets, legalizing the destruction of a fragile environment, and finally selling those coveted resources to our corporations at bargain price. When the leader resists, they are overthrown or assassinated by CIA-sponsored jackals. We were so successful in the third world that our bosses directed us to implement similar strategies in the United States and across the rest of the planet. The result is an unsustainable form of capitalism that is the driving force behind the current economic crisis. Despite temporary recoveries, this crisis is leading edge of a global tsunami. Joihn wrote many books. One of his famous books is Confession of Economic Hitman. It was in the list of New York Times bestseller for more than a year and a half, and it translated to 30 different languages. Another book, American History, Secret History of American Empire. His second book, another book that was the bestseller. He also have books about Spirit of Schwartz, The Stress-Free Habit, The World is as You Dream It. He is a founder and member of a Dream Change and Pachamama Alliance non-profit organization devoted to establishing a world our children will want to inherit. Has lectured at universities and 4 continents. The latest news about Joihn Perkins is that he's going to be in Iceland in October 9 to receive a grant for peace called Lennon Ono, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, the prize for the peace 2012. Joihn wrote about Lennon that John Lennon is one of my heroes. His music, his writing, and the courage he exhibited when he spoke against injustice and took action for peace have inspired me since my college year. His example, his willingness to stand up to those who would have us believe the exploitation and war are part of the human condition, and his commitment to to creating a sustainable and peaceful world encouraged me to write Confession of an Economic Hitman. Here, John Perkins, please.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. My Farsi is not very good, but Shak Baher. When I spent a lot of time in Iran back in the 70s, and my Farsi was much better then, but I haven't had an opportunity to practice. I loved your country very much. I traveled all over, from Caspian Sea to Kirman to Bandar Abbas, mainly in Tehran, but all over. And I must say, it was an amazing, wonderful education for me, and learned a lot about culture from the Persian people. And it's indeed a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Doctor, for that beautiful introduction and for inviting me here. I think we're at this incredible time in human history where Iran is once again actually on the forefront of world news. And sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable for all of us. What's going on in the Middle East and what's going on around the world is sometimes uncomfortable and difficult to deal with. But what's most important, I think, is for us all to understand that we are living, you and I are living, in perhaps the most revolutionary times humanity has ever experienced. I think the time that we're living in is a greater revolution than the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, the American Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, any revolutions. I think what we're experiencing today is a revolution in consciousness. We're moving into a new era. And when we start to move into a new era, there's always tremendous resistance. And you in Iran, the people of Iran, you are not in Iran right now, but you're from Iran, many of you, are experiencing tremendously that resistance. We in the United States are experiencing that resistance. You in the United States are experiencing that resistance. It's being experienced in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, throughout the Middle East. And people are really, really waking up. I think we're having this time in history when we're really waking up. You know, here we have the Occupy movement. You have amazing movements in Iran. There's amazing movements throughout the Middle East, what's called the Arab Spring, which isn't just restricted to the Arab countries, as you know, it's also in Iran. And Latin America has had a huge resurgence of democracies that we don't even talk about much in the United States. Tremendous things going on in the world today. And I think this is a phenomenal time for us all to be gathered here and coming together. And what I'm supposed to talk about tonight is hoodwinked, what wrecked our economy and how to fix it, and I will talk about that, but I think this all ties together so very, very, very closely. And so for me, it's a great pleasure to be here with my Iranian, my Persian brothers and sisters, and I felt I spent a lot of time, probably close to a total of 2 years in Iran during the 1970s. 3 months here, 4 months there, 2 weeks here. It was over a period of 10 years, and I absolutely fell in love with your country and your people, you people. And you were so incredibly hospitable to me. I had many very close Iranian friends, and some of them I've totally lost touch with. I was hustled out of your country, as you who've read the book may know, a couple of days before the bombs went off in the theaters. I haven't been back since. And I think that was the beginning, in a way, of this time that we're entering now of turmoil, crisis, and transformation. We can say that we're in a period of time that's unlike any that human beings have ever experienced before. You know, we can say that for the first time in the history of this planet, every being on this planet, human, plant, and animal, every living creature on this planet is experiencing the same crises. This has never happened before. It used to be, there would be earthquakes in some places and hurricanes in other places and tsunamis in other places. But today, every being on this planet is experiencing climate change, chaos. We can argue about what causes it, but we know that the glaciers are melting. We know the oceans are rising. We know climate is changing. There's no question about it anymore. We know that our resources are declining at accelerating rates. Populations of human populations are increasing at accelerating rates. Many animal species are going into extinction at the same time. And for the first time in human history also, we're all communicating with each other. This has never happened before. A few years ago, I was up in the Himalayas at about 17,000 feet, standing next to a huge glacier, talking to a nomadic chieftain, nomadic tribe up there, and he was lamenting. He was sorry about the fact that his people would never have telephones, he said, because the telephone lines would never reach there. But a few weeks ago, I talked to him through a translator on a cellular satellite cell phone. They now have telephones at the top of the Himalayas. They have cell phones deep in the Amazon. All over this planet now, for the first time in history, we have the capability of communicating with each other. This is revolutionary. And we're understanding that we're all facing the same crises. It doesn't matter whether we're living in Iran, or whether we're living in the Philippines, or in Botswana, or Bolivia, we're all facing these crises. I have a 5-year-old grandson. His name is Grant. And when I walk with him, I live on an island off the coast of Seattle. We have a lot of forests. And I walk with him in the forest. And when I walk with him, I think, what will this world look like 6 decades from now when he's my age? And I think we all know that it's going to be very ugly if we keep going like this. But we have the opportunity to change. This is the time of tremendous opportunity. And I think we all realize that the only way my grandson, Grant, can have a sustainable, just, peaceful world, a world he will want to inherit, is if every child growing up in Iran and Indonesia and Ecuador and Israel and Palestine has that same world. I think we're beginning to recognize that we live on a very tiny, fragile space station, the Earth. But unlike the space station that our astronauts built, this one doesn't have any shuttles. You can't get off it. I can't get off it. Grant won't be able to get off it. Your grandchildren won't be able to get off it. We've got to take care of it. We've got to move beyond this concern of, whether we're Shiite or Sunni, whether we're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist. We've got to move beyond that and understand that whatever we are, whatever our religion is, whatever our culture is, whatever the color of our skin is, we're all living on a fragile space station, and we must come together. And I think this is an amazing time to realize that, and I think this gathering here tonight, all of you who I understand every week you have meetings like this with speakers and come together. I think this is such a beautiful expression of how we can make that work, how we can build bridges, how we can come together. And, I realized, I'm going to get into a little bit more what wrecked our economy, and so I'll move into that now. But I think it's pretty obvious to us that in recent history, I'm an economist by training. My book says I was an economic hitman. My official title was chief economist at a major U.S. consulting firm that did a lot of work under the Shah in Iran. That's when I spent time there in the 70s. And I think, it doesn't take an economist to admit that the global economy that we've created is an absolute failure. There's so many ways to see it as a failure, and I'm just going to mention a couple of those. One is that we in the United States are less than 5% of the world's population, and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is starving or on the verge of starvation. That's a failure. It's not a model. You can't repeat that model. You can't repeat it as a model. China can't replicate it. Africa can't replicate it. Iran can't replicate it. South America can't replicate it. 5% of the world's population consuming 30% of the world's resources. You do the numbers and you know it's a failure. It's not a model. We can't continue it. We've got to change. And then within that 5%, we all know that less than 1% control most of those resources. 400 individuals in the United States have more assets than 50% of the rest of the country. 400 individuals, that's not 1%, it's 5 zeros, it's 0.000035% control as many assets as 50% of the rest of this country. These are terrible statistics, but they're there, and they're telling us we must change. It's not working. And we also know that in the United States, about 20% of the official budget goes to killing people. We have a war economy, we have a death economy. 20% of the official budget goes to the military, but that does not include the war in Afghanistan or Iraq. It does not include Homeland Security. It does not include the intelligence community. If we included all of those and the spin-off effects, the insurance companies and the food vendors, we'd reach about 60% of the US budget goes to supporting death. And then another whole percent goes to drilling oil, cutting trees, destroying the earth. That's more death. We really are living in a death economy, and we must change it. So my whole thing is we've got to move from a death economy to a life economy. And I think all of the tension that goes on today between the politicians in Iran and the politicians in the United States and in Israel and in Syria and throughout just so represents this tension. Because what happens when there's threats of war, as we're going through now, there's threats of possible war, you know, in the Middle East, war with Iran, who benefits? The military companies, the ones that make the weapons. They don't have to have war. Just the threat of war brings in tremendous amounts of money to these companies. We have this death economy, and we must, as mature human beings, as people who are concerned about the future of our children, move beyond that into a life economy. So we're in this state now that's extremely difficult, a huge state of crisis. There's no question about it. But crisis offers opportunity. And I am extremely hopeful. I'm going to move into that in a moment. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about how we got here and my own role in it, because everybody always wants to hear about what did an economic hitman do. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen created we've created the world's first truly global empire. It's not an American empire. It's not a national empire. It's a corporate empire. It's an empire that's run by the big multinationals. And Iran was a great case in point back in the 70s when I was spending a lot of time in Iran. As you all know only too well, you had a pretty amazing prime minister named Mossadegh, democratically elected, who went up against the oil companies, primarily what is now British Petroleum, and was overthrown in a CIA coup that was run by a fellow named Kermit Roosevelt. And I think the history behind that is that the oil companies did not want to give in to Mossadegh's demands that they pay more money to the Iranian people for Iranian oil. And Eisenhower, President Eisenhower at the time, was afraid to go to war with Iran or to threaten Iran with war because Iran is right on the border with Russia, and Russia had nuclear weapons, the United States had nuclear weapons. Everybody was afraid of a nuclear war. There were the Dulles brothers who ran the State Department and the CIA. They were real hawks. And they said, but we got to get Mossadegh out of there. He's setting a bad precedent for oil around the world. And so Eisenhower basically said, yeah, but we can't start a war, so we'll try something else. Send in Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, great-grandson, with a few $1 million, and instead of fomenting a war, pay people off to demonstrate against Mossadegh, make him look unpopular, overthrow him. So as you know, the short story is he was overthrown in a coup, put under house arrest. The Shah was brought in. Shah was a good friend of oil companies. But as you know, that created a huge undercurrent of backlash. And eventually the mullahs took over, and we reached the state we're at today. It's very blatant in Iran. It's much more subtle in many other countries, and I can name a lot of them. Countries like Egypt and Indonesia and Ecuador and Venezuela and Nicaragua. You can go on, where it was much more subtle. Iran, it was pretty overt ultimately. But this is the way this empire was produced. That basically people like me, economic hitmen with fancy titles like chief economist, would go into a country that had resources that our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country. In the case of Iran, we didn't even need to arrange loans because you had the collateral, you had the oil in the ground. But in other countries, we had arranged these loans from the World Bank or the American Development Bank or the big multinational banking organizations. But the money never actually went to the country. Instead, it went to the big multinational companies to build infrastructure projects. And you saw this clearly in Iran. Highways, huge power systems, power plants and distribution and transmission lines, ports and airports, things that would benefit a few wealthy people in the country who own the industry, who own the commercial centers, as well as benefiting our own corporations, the multinationals that built these things, but didn't benefit the majority of the people who couldn't afford to buy electricity, didn't use ports or highways, and yet they were left holding a huge debt that they couldn't repay. So at some point we go back and say, hey, since you can't repay your debt, sell your oil or whatever the resource is real cheap to our companies. Vote with us on the United Nations vote. Allow us to build a military base on your soil. And I mean, I was so aware in Iran that we had such leverage, such political leverage with the Shah, with the Iranian government in those days. I was very much involved in financing the construction of that huge military base down in Bandar Abbas on the Straits of Hormuz. I was down in Bandar Abbas. It's the hottest place I've ever been in my life. My God, I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to hot places, but they're dry. Bandar Abbas was hot and humid. My God, was that place hot. And I actually really enjoyed it. I like heat. When I went there, when I first went to Bandar Abbas, it was a sleepy little fishing village. By the time I left, it was this huge construction site where the US government is building a huge military base for the Shah so that he can close down the Straits of Hormuz, if the Arab countries get to be too much of a problem. And now, of course, it's all being, it's being threatened to be used against us, that if we cause problems, that the current government of Iran will shut down the Straits of Hormuz and left roughly 30% of the oil flow of the world. So it's very, very interesting to me how these things operate. So, of course, the real winners. Who are the real winners? The big multinationals who built the port. Yeah, I mean, they made fortunes off this, and really, they don't care whether the Shah owns it or the mullahs. They don't care. And the big multinationals think we won the war in Vietnam. We won in Iraq. We're winning in Afghanistan because they're making billions and trillions of dollars off this. They are calling the shots around the world. You could say that a few hundred years ago, the geopolitics of this planet were controlled by religious organizations. And then it was governments. And some governments were totalitarian, some were dictatorships, some were republics, some were democracies. But today the governments don't control. It's the big multinationals. And we know that in this country, nobody gets elected president without tremendous financial support from the big corporations. It is not Obama's fault, but he's under the control of the big corporations. And you will not become president of the United States unless you sell your soul to the big corporations. It's not Obama's fault, it's not Romney's fault, it's not anybody's fault, it's the system, and it's tragic. But the first way to change that system is to truly understand and admit that it's happening. It has happened. The corporations have taken over. They own the mainstream media, either outright or through advertising budgets. They own the government because of the campaign funds, and even if we had a president of the United States or a bunch of senators who were not under the control of the corporations, they would still have to face over 10,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. In 1970, there were less than 200 lobbyists in this city. Today, there's over 10,000, and they work for the big corporations. Our politics here in the United States has been taken over by robber barons. Now, I have to tell you, I'm a very loyal American. One of my ancestors was Tom Paine, who wrote one of the most important revolutionary documents of this country. He was a fifth grade granduncle of mine. Another one was Ethan Allen, who won the first battle in the Revolution, the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga. I go back in this country. My relatives have fought in every major war that this country's fought except the most recent ones. I am very loyal, and I'm very, very disturbed by what's happened to my country, just as I'm sure a lot of you are disturbed at what's happened to your country, if it isn't this country, and some of you it is. If it's Iran, you're disturbed. We're disturbed, and I'm determined to do something about it. It's the time to take matters into our hands, we the people. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence of this country, the United States, says it has to be we the people. Those documents tell us that our president cannot do it. We have to do it. And that's never been more true than today. And so as we move forward and we look at where we've come from, so what wrecked our economy? Well, I think we have to look at the fact that the economy has been taken over by the big corporations. There's no question. Two of the Nobel Prize-winning U.S. economists recently have written books, Joe Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, who, in both of these books, they basically come to the conclusion that economics is not a science, it's not even an art, it's controlled by politics. These two Nobel Prize-winning U.S. economists have said, in no uncertain terms, that economics isn't what we thought it was. That economics may have been at one time a science, an art, it's now under the control of politics. What they don't say, but what I think we all know, and I think what they know, is that politics is controlled by big corporations. So in essence, the economy is controlled by big corporations. Now, I was raised as an economist. I went to business school and I was taught supply and demand, all these theories. But the fact of the matter is what we're learning now from some of the top economists in the world, that has nothing to do with it. It's all politics, and politics is controlled by big corporations. So there's a new empire in the world today, and that's the leaders of the big corporations, what I call the corporatocracy. This is not a conspiracy theory. These people don't have to conspire, but they all follow one goal. And that goal was expressed by Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics in the 1970s, as stated this way: the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. That's new. When I went to business school in the 60s, I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent return on investment and takes really good care of his employees, gives them health care, insurance, retirement funds. A good CEO will take a big cut in pay before he'll lay anybody off. Can you imagine Donald Trump adhering to that? Or Jack Welch of GE? No, Jack Welch laid off a quarter of General Electric and took a huge raise. That's not what I was taught. I was taught that a good CEO sacrifices for his company. And he takes good care of his not only his employees, but also those who supply his company, and his customers, and the communities where his organization works. He pays taxes. And he goes beyond that. He donates money to schools and recreation centers, to civil movements, to good causes. That all changed in the 1970s when we came up with this idea that no. The only thing corporations have to do is maximize profits. And Ronald Reagan bought into it, Margaret Thatcher bought into it, every US president, every major president around the world, Democrat, Republican alike, have bought into this concept. And what has it brought us? A devastated global economics. There's no other way to define it. It's insanity for everybody except the very rich. And they're doing really, really well, thank you very much, as we all know. So here we are at this time in history that we've proven to ourselves that we've created a monster. We've allowed a monster to be created. And we have to change it. This is the time for Iranians and Americans and Iranian Americans and Arabs and Arab Americans and Jewish people, Israelis and Israeli Americans and Latin Americans and African Americans and everybody to come together. This is the time when we must, for the sake of my grandson, which means for the sake of every child on this planet, we must come together. We have to recognize that no child growing up in the United States or Iran or Colombia or the Congo can have a sustainable, just, and peaceful world unless every child on this planet has that. This is new. Do you agree? Yes. Do you agree? Yes. Yes. Do you agree? Yes. So for me, like being here with you, many of you from Iran, not all of you, but many of you, in a country that changed my life, I have to tell you, I mean, I absolutely loved Iran. I had some difficult times there, of course, but I remember a time we were looking at building a transmission line from Kerman to Bandar Abbas. And I flew from Tehran to Kerman in a little tiny airplane and landed. I just have to tell a funny story here. And I was with two other engineers from the United States. I was the economist, I was with two engineers. And we landed in Kerman and we got to this little hotel. And I went to my room, we each had our own rooms, and we decided we agreed we'd meet for tea or beer or something or other at 5 o'clock after a while, take showers, and we got to the room, and it was one of these hotels that there was this faucet, and there was a shower, but no shower curtain or anything, just an open shower with a little drain hole. And then next to the toilet was another little faucet that you turn on and you put a bucket under it, fill the bucket, and flush the toilet with the bucket. This is back a while ago. And so I understood all this and went through the whole process and went out to where we were supposed to meet. One of the other engineers came out, and our boss, the third guy engineer, came out, and we hadn't got our luggage yet, it hadn't come in yet, and he comes out and he's dripping wet, he's covered with water. and he turned to flush the toilet, he turned the shower faucet, and he was standing right there, so just covered it totally with water, which was, and he was a very funny, he couldn't have happened to a better person, he was my boss, you know. and then the next day we got our luggage and we had a car and we had 3 people from the Ministry of Energy, an Iranian with us, a driver and a translator and another high official, and we were driving down in this kind of station wagon car down from Kerman down, headed to Bandar Abbas through that desert, which was absolutely beautiful, but hot, and the air conditioner in this car wasn't working. And us three North Americans are sitting in the back seat, and I'm in the middle. I'm the biggest guy, but I'm the youngest. These other guys are my seniors, you know. So I'm sitting in the middle, and there's this big hump, you know, where the drive shaft comes through, and I'm sitting on the drive shaft, and all of a sudden there's this horrible smell in this car of fire, and the driver slams on his brake and yells, and the interpreter yells, "Everybody out!" So everybody jumped out of the car, and I tried to jump out of the car, but I couldn't. I was stuck to the floor. And finally, I was wearing these, what are called topsiders, you know, these sailor's shoes. And I slipped out of them, and I leaped out of the car out into the desert. And we looked back in, and my topsiders had totally melted, the rubber soles, because the drive shaft of the car had gotten so hot without air conditioning. So it was a very funny trip, the whole thing, you know. But the desert was so beautiful. And later that day, we ended up at an oasis with fig and date trees, and it was just, I was just so taken. And then when we got to Banderbas, I actually really enjoyed Banderbas. That was back when it was still a fishing village. It was just, it was charming. It was a beautiful spot. I have such amazing memories of Iran. It was a beautiful education for me. And so it's thinking about how those times interconnect with these times, and how, you know, back then, Iran to me seemed very far away. And I worked in Indonesia, and that seemed very far away. In Latin America, and these were all very different cultures. And it was difficult to make a phone call from Jakarta, Indonesia, or Tehran to Boston. And now, I can send a whole book instantaneously over the internet. I mean, how the world has changed. How this world has changed in those, what seemed to me like few years. And if we really understand how we know now that we are so interconnected, and we have to come together. We have to drop the prejudices. We have to drop the anger and the hatred, and we have to understand that, I want to say there are no bad people in the world, but I think there are some psychopaths. You have a few in Iran, we have quite a few in the United States, and some of them running our biggest corporations. There are some people that have got their screws loose up here. We have to deal with them. They'll always be there. There'll always be rapists and a few psychopaths, but the rest of us are not. And the corporations that are running the world today are just corporations. And what is important for us to understand is that we have control over these corporations. They depend on you and me to support them. Many corporations have failed. Some of the biggest ones in the world have gone away. Companies like Kodak and Polaroid and ITT and huge corporations that no longer exist. They're very vulnerable, and they know it. So this empire is built on these very, very vulnerable organizations, and we have tremendous power over them. But we must exercise it. We must exercise it. And I think it's so important for us to understand that the marketplace is a democracy. And you vote every time you buy something or choose not to. But you got to send an email and let them know how you're voting. You know, when I was a college student in business school, I went to school in Boston. I couldn't walk beside the Charles River, it was so polluted. The Potomac here was terribly polluted. There were rivers on fire in Ohio with pollution. No more. We forced the corporations to clean them up. There was apartheid in South Africa. We boycotted corporations that supported it, got rid of it. We forced corporations to hire more women and minorities, open their doors wider, get rid of trans fats. Tremendous progress that we've made in this way. And you know, now we're understanding that we need to ratchet this up a notch, not just go after these single issues, but we need to get these corporations to redefine that goal that Milton Friedman expressed. The only responsibility of business is to maximize profits. We need to change that and say the responsibility of business is to serve a public interest, to create a world that my grandson will want to inherit, to create a sustainable, just, peaceful world, a world where all beings can thrive. That is the job of corporations, and you won't buy from any that don't commit to doing that, right?
Right.
We've got to force these corporations, and remember that they're just us. You work for the corporations, many of you. I work for them. We all buy from them. They're not evil. They're just corporations, and we have the power over them. It matters how we vote in this presidential election. I believe it does matter. But I don't think it matters nearly as much as how we vote every time we go shopping. But we have to tell them. We have to tell Nike, I like your products and I like the fact that you're doing a better job environmentally, you're putting water in your glues instead of oil, but you've got slaves working for you in sweatshops around the world. I will not buy from you, Nike, until you pay those people a decent wage. Send them an email. Send them an email. I want to wear the swoosh. I've been a consultant to Nike for years, and I've told Phil Knight, I want to wear your damn swoosh, or swish, or whatever the hell it is, swatch sticker. But I won't wear it until you start paying your people a decent wage everywhere. We must send out this message for our sakes, and our children's sakes, and our grandchildren's sakes. So the United States and Europe right now has launched this campaign of sanctions against Iran. And I don't know what you all think about that. But what I would like to say is I think we all ought to launch sanctions against corporations that are not creating a world that my grandson wants when he grows up. That's where we need to direct the sanctions. And I just have to say, I may rattle a few cages here, but you know, I am a loyal American, and I don't think America really has any place trying to dictate any of the policies of Iran or Egypt or any place else. I think that, you know, we can support groups there that are trying to create change, but I think change has to come from within. That this is a time that the United States, and I spend a lot of time in Latin America, and what I hear constantly from my friends in Latin America, the president of Ecuador is a friend of mine, Rafael Correa, he's endorsed my books, and several of the other presidents, and they say, keep your country out of our business. You know, we can do it ourselves. Just keep your country out, and keep your military bases off our land. The United States has military bases in 137 countries, and they resent that. My friends in Latin America say, you know, we'd much rather go with China because China doesn't have any military bases here. Maybe they will in the future, but I think we in the United States really have to take a good look at who we are, what we're doing, and recognize that we do have the opportunity to be a model for the world. But modeling means modeling in a peaceful way, a truly democratic way, and really looking at how the corporations that come out, to a large degree, come out of this country, represent themselves in the world, the big multinationals. And it's our responsibility to really look at what these corporations are doing. And so, what wrecked our economy? This whole new system. The system that I helped implement as an economic hitman. I take full responsibility for what I did. And I'm spending the rest of my life trying to change it. So I think what wrecked our system is this economy that we've created that's based on these huge multinationals having a goal of only maximizing profits, an extremely greedy, selfish goal that makes a few people very, very, very wealthy, no matter what happens. Global collapse, recession, they get more and more wealthy. The rest of us suffer. That's what really wrecked our economy. And the fact that we've allowed it to happen. You know, to a large degree, we consumers have said, I want cheap clothes, cheap t-shirts and blue jeans and whatever, and if that means they've got to be made in sweatshops in Indonesia, I'll just look the other way. I want cheap petroleum for my car. And if that means destroying the Amazon rainforest or causing havoc in the Middle East or Iran, I'll just look the other way. Well, we must send another message. That's not what we want. We want a world that our children and grandchildren will want to inherit every place on this planet. So I'm going to end this talk now, and we can open it to questions and discussion. But I want to end by really looking at so how can we fix it? How can you fix it? What is the role that each of you has to play in this? And I think that's a very important question. First of all, we all must be very, very conscious of how we support corporations. To only support corporations that are committed to making a decent rate of return on investments, because that's the only way they can generate capital, but only within the context of creating a sustainable, just, peaceful world, serving a public interest. For the first 100 years, the United States was a country. No corporation could get a charter in any state unless it proved it was going to serve a public interest. And charters lasted on average 10 years, and then the corporation had to go back and prove it served a public interest and would continue to do so. That all changed in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court here decided that corporations had the rights but not the responsibilities of individuals. There's an extremely important vote or case up before the Supreme Court right now about Shell in Nigeria. And the real question of this case about Shell in Nigeria is that now that the Supreme Court established with Citizens United that corporations have the rights of individuals, the question now before them in the case of Shell in Nigeria is, do they also carry the responsibility of individuals? And that's the real question. And it's going to be fascinating to see how the Supreme Court decides this one, because they're caught in a big bind right now. They said courts have the rights of individuals. Are they going to now say courts have the responsibility of individuals? But we must say, yes, you have tremendous responsibility. And so it's up to us, every time we shop or decide not to let them know that we're only going to buy from the ones that adhere to that old principle that lasted for 100 years in this country, serve a public interest. No corporations that I know of are perfect. As probably none of us is. Well, maybe a few of you are, but I'm not. I know that. So we can't expect perfection, but support those corporations that are committed to trying, that are committed to moving us to the next level of consciousness. That's one thing that we can all do. Beyond that, what can you do, each of you as an individual? I think it's fair to say that each of you has passion. I know you have passion, and I know you have talents. I don't know what your individual passions or talents are. I have a passion for writing and hopefully some talent, so that's what I do. I devote myself to writing with passion and with as much talent as I can bring to bear about these very subjects, to change the world, to make a better world for my grandson. What can you do? Where are your passions? What are your talents? We can all take different routes, different paths, but if we head for the same destination of a sustainable, just, peaceful, thriving world for all, we'll get there. As a student of the American Revolution, I was always struck by how lucky we are in the United States that George Washington did not write pamphlets. And Tom Paine did not try to lead armies. Washington had a passion and talent for writing pamphlets. He wrote Common Sense and others that motivated people to join the revolution. And George Washington led armies. Martha Washington organized women to make clothes and bullets for men at the forefront. They all took very different paths, followed their passions, their talents, headed for the same destination. And I think that's the lesson. Every one of us can take a different path, the path of our own hearts, of our passion, of our talents. But let's all head for that same destination of creating a world our children and grandchildren will want to inherit. And the children and grandchildren of every species on every corner of this planet will want to inherit. And if we do that, we'll get there. And so this is an amazing time of opportunity. This is a time of the greatest revolution in human history, and you happen to be lucky enough to be born at this time. I'm lucky enough. I'm so grateful. I used to think, damn, I wish I'd been born in the 1700s so I could be part of the American Revolution. But now I know this is bigger. This is a worldwide, a global revolution. It's a revolution in consciousness. This is a much better time to be a revolutionary. And we don't have to use a gun. We can use just our speech and how we shop. I don't think this revolution is going to require violence. It's just going to require a mindset change, a change in habits and patterns. So this is a greater revolution. And it's also an awful lot more comfortable. We have better toilets. Showers. Lights. You know, I just flew in here from Seattle. We were able to do that. I didn't have to ride a horse across the country, you know. So I think this is an amazing time to be alive. And I just want to close. We can open this up. I think we're going to take a little break between now and the questions and answers, but I want to close by sharing a quote with you, by reading a quote that I have here. And this quote is a couple hundred years old, but I think it's very relevant to these times. So this was written back when the American Revolution was in big trouble. George Washington had lost just about every battle he fought for 2 years. He didn't win any of them. And he wasn't getting any support from the Continental Congress. He couldn't get blankets for his men or shoes or even bullets. He was in Valley Forge, living miserably. It's estimated that about 20% of the people in America supported the revolution. About 40% were Tories. They were loyalists. They were against the revolution. And the other 40% didn't know what they want, which reminds me a lot of the times we're in right now. And along comes this guy, Tom Paine, at Valley Forge. And in December 1776, Paine writes these words, which I think are so relevant to our time right now. Paine says, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he or she who stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. A generous parent should say, if there must be trouble, let it be in my day that my child may have peace. If there must be trouble, let it be in our day that our children may have peace." Paine goes on to say, "I love the man or woman who can smile in trouble, who can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious future." By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious future. And I think we're here tonight so that our children and grandchildren, my grandson Grant, can look back 60 years from now and say, thank goodness those people came together the first day of October in 2012 and all committed to going out and making a better world. For me and my generation, my grandson will be able to say that. And through perseverance and fortitude, we will create a glorious day for ourselves, our children and grandchildren. And I look forward to joining you on that journey. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes break and then come back for question and answer. Mr. Joihn Perkins' books, his last book is at the end. Mansour is there.